In life, you hear something and it sticks with you for a very long time. Sometimes you hear something and it changes how you see the world. Well, that took place in this week's Torah portion. I heard this idea in the name of a great rabbi named Rabbi Malkiel Cutler 20 plus years ago in a shul in Pittsburgh. The rabbi spoke about it and quoted Rabbi Malkiel with this idea. Listen to it. So this week's Torah portion, Jacob is leaving his house. Remember? He's got the blessings, got to run. Rebecca, his mom, said, go to my brother Laban and you'll go there. So he goes, and that is where he builds his family. He marries both daughters and their maidservants, and the tribes of Israel begin. This week's Torah portion. So Jacob comes to town, and it's at that moment in town where they're about to move the rock off the well. Think about it. Back in the old days, the most valuable asset they had was water. And so they protected it. So they probably had one well of fresh water, and they put a huge rock on it so those snakes or whatever else would get in. And every day at some point, everyone would get around the well, and all the shepherds would lift the well, and they would feed the sheep, and people would drink the water and take the water back to their homes, and then they would cover the well again. So at that moment where they were about to do that, Jacob rolls in. He looks around and goes, what's up? And people were sitting around because they didn't have enough people to lift the rock. And at that second, who's coming? Rachel, probably get water. And he sees Rachel. And now Jacob's not a regular dude. Like Jacob just had a dream with angels going up and down. He's not a human. He's beyond. He sees Rachel and he knows that Rachel is his soulmate. And he's so lifted up by that feeling that he turns to the rock that needed a bunch of people to lift it. And on his own, he lifts the rock. That's the story. But Cutler asks a great question. That's the story? Like for real? Like that's the Torah story of one of our Jacob, right? The first father with the tribes of Israel. Like that's his story. He gets inspired, so he goes out and like lifts the rock. Really? Like, have you ever heard a story of a major rabbi that gets inspired and he lifts the car like over his head, like he's flexing? That's how un-Jewish is that? Like we got a lot of talents. Usually we don't win the bodybuilder contest. Like really, that's the Torah. That's what the Torah is going with. He couldn't wait for the crew to get around. Like he had to like go out and lift it. And Rashi, who was the commentator, says, "Oh yeah, you think so?" He popped it like a cork out of a bottle to show how strong he was. Like he doubles down. Like what is going on over here? Since when is physical strength our thing that we're putting in the Torah? So he gives a beautiful insight that really, I said, shifted how I see the world. And here's how it goes. We live in a world and we think that the way the world works is the following. It follows the following equation. Ability leads to responsibility. I have, so then I give, right? I have wealth, so then I share. I'm generous. I have smarts, so then I teach. I have a good voice, so then I sing, right? If I have a talent in an area, I go out and give that talent to the world, right? We think you're born with something or you get stuff. And then what you got to do is you got to go out and share it. It's nice. It's not totally accurate. You do have stuff that you got to give, but the equation is actually not that way. That's it's a material way of seeing the world. And the spiritual world doesn't work like that. Here's how it works. You're born with a soul. That soul is greater and more powerful than anything in the physical world. God's running a world. What takes place every day is beyond what I was born with and what I have. It's not ability that leads to responsibility. I have, so I give. It's actually flipped. It's responsibility leads to ability. We have an enormous amount of ability, but how does it come out? You see, if you're waiting to have it before you give it, you're never going to fully reach it. But when you take responsibility for something beyond yourself, when you take responsibility for something that is beyond what you think your ability is, especially if it's what's right and what's good and what's beneficial to others, when you take responsibility for something, what happens is then you can get the ability. It's not that ability leads to responsibility. It's that responsibility leads to ability. And we always wonder, like, how come some people are so great? Do they have some greatness gene? No, they didn't. They're regular people that took great responsibility. When you look at like incredible things that people did, last generation, people that and you're like, how could one person be so kind, generous, courageous? They must be different. They're not different. They just took responsibility. And when they took responsibility, they tapped into their abilities that was always there, but dormant. Because we don't know what we can become until we take responsibility for something beyond what we think we can do. The story of Jacob is this story. Jacob was the one who couldn't lift the rock. Jacob was the one that Isaac almost passed over because his brother was the strong one. And Jacob comes down and the rock needs to get lifted right now. God says, that rock's got to get lifted. And Jacob sees the rock and takes responsibility for the rock. And because he took responsibility and that rock needed to be lifted, he got the ability to do it. Because it's the responsibility of lifting that gave him the power to lift. That's the lesson of our lives. There could be so many things that we are not accessing because we don't know we could. And we'll never know until we take responsibility for more than ourselves. We stretch, we try, we climb, we push. And by doing it, what happens is we tap into that deeper spiritual source. It's not ability that leads to responsibility. It's responsibility that leads to ability.